Viktor Petrov had been flying cargo runs through the outer colonies for 22 years, which meant he'd survived engine failures, pirate attacks, navigational anomalies, and customs inspectors who thought human pilots were inherently suspicious. His ship, the Wandering Star, was a 30-year-old Terran freighter that held together through skill, stubbornness, and what Viktor privately called aggressive maintenance techniques. But he'd never had his ship pulled out of hyperspace by a planet. What the hell? Viktor muttered as emergency alarms filled the cockpit, and his navigation systems displayed readings that shouldn't have been possible. According to his instruments, something had grabbed the Wandering Star during transit and yanked it into normal space around a world that wasn't on any star charts. The planet below was beautiful in a way that made Viktor's breath catch swirling. Patterns of blue and green that suggested oceans and continents, cloud formations that moved in spirals too perfect to be natural, and an overall sense of life and vitality that was visible even from orbit. It was also dying. Viktor's sensors detected massive atmospheric disruption, gravitational anomalies that were tearing apart the planet's crust, and energy readings that suggested something catastrophic was happening to the world's core. Unknown vessel. A voice came through his communication system, speaking accented. Galactic Standard. You have been brought here by Gaia's final effort. We apologize for the involuntary arrival, but we require assistance that only your species may be able to provide. Viktor looked at his sensor displays, trying to understand what he was seeing. This is Viktor Petrov, of the cargo vessel Wandering Star. Who am I speaking with? And what do you mean your planet brought me here? Captain Petrov, this is Administrator Lyra Earthsong of the Gaian Collective. Our world is dying, and our planetary consciousness has identified human piloting capabilities as potentially crucial to preventing complete biosphere collapse. Viktor stared at his instruments. A planetary consciousness? A world that could pull ships out of hyperspace? 22 years of cargo runs had exposed him to a lot of unusual situations, but this was beyond his experience. Administrator, I'm just a cargo pilot. I don't know what kind of assistance you think I can provide for planetary scale problems. Captain Petrov, please allow us to guide your ship to our primary spaceport. We will explain the situation in detail, but time is extremely limited. Gaia's consciousness is failing, and without intervention, this world will become uninhabitable. Within 72 hours. Viktor looked at his fuel readings, his course calculations, and the urgent cargo delivery he was supposed to make to the Centauri colonies. Then he looked at the planet below, where billions of lives were apparently depending on help that only a human pilot could provide. Administrator Earthsong, transmit your landing coordinates. I'm coming down. The descent through Gaia's atmosphere was unlike anything Viktor had experienced in 2 decades of piloting. Instead of the routine process of following atmospheric flight paths and dealing with atmospheric resistance, Viktor felt like his ship was being gently guided by forces he couldn't identify. The Wandering Star moved through cloud layers with impossible smoothness, navigated wind currents that seemed to part specifically for his passage, and touched down at the designated spaceport with a precision that exceeded his own piloting skills. As Viktor emerged from his ship, the first thing he noticed was how alive everything felt. The air itself seemed to pulse with energy. The ground beneath his feet vibrated with subtle rhythms, and the plants and trees around the spaceport moved in ways that suggested awareness rather than just response to wind. The second thing he noticed was Administrator Lyra Earthsong, who looked exactly like what Viktor would have expected from someone whose world was dying exhausted, desperate, and barely holding on to hope. Captain Petrov, she said, approaching with the kind of formal desperation that suggested she was trying to remain professional while her world collapsed around her. Thank you for responding to our emergency. I realize this situation is unprecedented. Viktor looked around the spaceport, noting how the architecture seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being built on top of it, and how every surface seemed to pulse with organic energy. Administrator, help me understand what's happening here. You said your planetary consciousness is failing? Gaia is what your people might call a living world. The planet itself is conscious, capable of supporting and coordinating all life within its biosphere. For thousands of years, Gaia has maintained perfect ecological balance, prevented natural disasters, and ensured the survival and prosperity of all species living here. And now, Administrator Earthsong's expression grew grave. 3 weeks ago, Gaia began experiencing what we can only describe as systematic consciousness collapse. The planetary awareness that coordinates weather patterns, geological stability, and biological systems is shutting down. Without Gaia's active management, this world will experience cascading ecological failure that will render it uninhabitable. Victor tried to process the implications. You're talking about the death of an entire planet's worth of life. 43 billion individual beings, representing over 12,000 species. Captain Petrov, we have tried everything our science and technology can accomplish. Nothing has been able to restore Gaia's consciousness or even slow its deterioration. So why do you think a human cargo pilot can help? Administrator Earthsong looked at Victor with an expression that mixed desperation with something that might have been hope. Because Gaia's final coherent action was to reach across space and bring you here. Captain, our planetary consciousness used the last of its coordinated energy to pull your ship out of hyperspace. Gaia chose you specifically for reasons we don't understand, but we have to believe that choice was made for good reasons. Victor looked around at the living spaceport, feeling the subtle vibrations of a world that was slowly losing the consciousness that kept it alive. Administrator, I need to understand what you think I can do. I'm a pilot. I fly ships through space. I don't have experience with planetary consciousness or biological systems management. Captain Petrov, we don't know what Gaia sees in human piloting capabilities that might help restore planetary consciousness. But we know that you're here because Gaia brought you here, and we know that our world has less than 72 hours before total biosphere collapse. Victor thought about 22 years of flying through impossible situations, solving problems that conventional training said were unsolvable, and finding ways to keep his ship functioning when any reasonable person would have given up. Administrator, show me what you've tried so far, and then show me everything you can about how this planetary consciousness actually works. Administrator Earthsong's expression shifted to something that might have been relief. Captain, are you saying you'll attempt to help us? Victor looked up at the sky, where clouds were moving in patterns that suggested a dying mind trying to maintain control over forces that were slipping away. Administrator, I'm saying I'll do what I always do when everything seems impossible. I'll figure out what's actually broken, and then I'll fix it. The Gaian Collective's research center looked like a combination of advanced laboratory and organic garden, with scientific equipment that seemed to grow from living walls and monitoring systems that pulsed with the same rhythms Victor had felt throughout the planet's surface. Gaia's consciousness operates through what we call the neural web. Dr. Sage Morgan explained as she showed Victor holographic displays of the planet's biological and geological systems. Every living thing on this world is connected through quantum biological interfaces that allow for planet-wide coordination and communication. Victor studied the displays, noting patterns that reminded him of navigation systems and control networks. Dr. Morgan, this looks like a distributed processing system, like a computer network, but biological. That's an excellent analogy, Captain. Gaia's consciousness emerges from the interaction of billions of individual neural nodes trees. Plants, animals, geological formations, even atmospheric particles, all connected through quantum entanglement and biological communication. And this network is failing? Dr. Morgan manipulated the holographic display to show areas where the neural web connections were dark or flickering. The failure began in the planetary core consciousness centers and has been spreading outward. We're losing connection nodes faster than the remaining network can compensate. Victor had seen similar cascading system failures in ship networks, where damaged components caused increasing stress on remaining systems until total failure occurred. Dr. Morgan, what caused the initial failure in the core consciousness centers? We don't know. The breakdown began without warning and has resisted every intervention we've attempted. Our best hypothesis is that Gaia's consciousness has reached some kind of processing limit or encountered a problem it cannot solve through normal planetary management. Administrator Earthsong joined them from across the research center. Captain Petrov, Dr. Morgan is our leading expert on Gaia's consciousness systems. If anyone can explain what we're dealing with, it's her. Victor continued studying the holographic displays, noting similarities between the neural web architecture and the complex systems he'd learned to troubleshoot over decades of keeping aging cargo ships functional. Dr. Morgan, you said the failure started in the core consciousness centers. What exactly are those? Deep underground caverns where Gaia's primary awareness nodes are located. Think of them as the central processing centers for planetary consciousness. They coordinate global weather patterns, geological stability, biological system balance, and the integration of information from the entire neural web. Have you been able to access these core centers to diagnose the problem directly? Dr. Morgan and Administrator Earthsong exchanged glances that suggested Victor had asked about something particularly difficult. Captain, Administrator Earthsong said carefully, the core consciousness centers are located 7 kilometers below the surface, accessible only through natural cave systems that require specialized navigation and survival skills. More importantly, they're protected by Gaia's defensive systems, which have become increasingly erratic as the planetary consciousness fails. Defensive systems? Biological and environmental protections that prevent unauthorized access to critical neural nodes. Under normal circumstances, these systems recognize authorized Gaian personnel and allow access. But with Gaia's consciousness failing, the defensive systems have become unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Victor nodded, recognizing the kind of problem that happened when automated safety systems malfunctioned during emergencies. So you need to get to the core consciousness centers to diagnose the problem. But you can't get there because the failing systems you're trying to fix are preventing access. Exactly. And Captain, even if we could reach the core centers safely, we're not certain we'd be able to understand or repair whatever is causing the consciousness failure. Victor was beginning to see why Gaia's final act had been to reach across space for help. Dr. Morgan, show me the navigation requirements for accessing the core consciousness centers. Dr. Morgan pulled up detailed maps of the underground cave systems, showing passages that twisted through 7 kilometers of geological formations with hazards that ranged from unstable caverns to hostile biological defensive systems. Victor studied the route, noting navigation challenges that reminded him of piloting through asteroid fields, nebula formations, and other hazardous environments. This looks like a 3-dimensional navigation problem through dynamically changing hazards with limited sensor data and unknown obstacles. That's actually a very accurate description, Dr. Morgan said. Captain, are you suggesting that piloting skills might be applicable to underground cave navigation? Dr. Morgan, I've been flying through impossible spaces for 20 years. Asteroid fields, ion storms, pirate ambush zones, customs checkpoints that don't want to be found. Navigation is navigation, whether you're flying through space or crawling through caves. Victor looked at the holographic displays again, this time focusing on the cave system layout rather than the biological systems. The real question is whether I can get to the core consciousness centers and actually help once I'm there. Dr. Morgan, what kind of diagnostic and repair capabilities would I need to restore planetary consciousness? Dr. Morgan looked uncertain. Captain, we don't know. No one has ever attempted to repair a failing planetary consciousness. We don't even know if it's technically possible. But you know it's dying, and you know where the failure started. Yes. Victor thought about 20 years of emergency repairs. On aging cargo ships, fixing problems that manufacturer specifications said were unfixable. Keeping systems running when conventional wisdom said they should have failed completely. Dr. Morgan, Administrator Earthsong, here's what I know about fixing complex systems that nobody understands completely. First, you get to the source of the problem. Second, you figure out what's actually broken instead of what you think should be broken. Third, you try things that probably won't work until you find something that does. He looked at the cave system maps again. I can get us to the core consciousness centers. I can navigate underground hazards, deal with malfunctioning defensive systems, and get us where we need to go. But once we're there, I'll need your expertise to understand what we're looking at. Us? Administrator Earthsong asked. Administrator, I'm a pilot, not a xenobiologist. If we're going to attempt planetary consciousness repair, I'll need Dr. Morgan's knowledge of how Gaia's systems work. Dr. Morgan stared at Victor. Captain, you're proposing that we descend 7 kilometers underground through failing defensive systems to attempt repairs on a form of consciousness that's never been fixed before, using techniques that don't exist yet. Dr. Morgan, that's a pretty accurate summary, yes. And you think this approach has a reasonable chance of success? Victor looked at the holographic displays showing the spreading failure of the neural web, the cascading system breakdowns that were killing an entire world, and the 43 billion lives that would be lost if they couldn't restore Gaia's consciousness. Dr. Morgan, I think it's the only approach that has any chance of success. And I think we have about 60 hours to make it work. Administrator Earthsong was quiet for a moment, studying Victor's expression. Captain Petrov, if you're willing to attempt this mission, the Gaian Collective will provide whatever resources and support you need. Administrator, I'll need underground navigation equipment, emergency supplies for extended cave exploration, and everything Dr. Morgan can tell me about Gaia's consciousness systems during the journey to the core centers. Victor looked at the cave system maps one more time, planning a route through 7 kilometers of hazardous underground terrain to reach the consciousness centers, where a dying planet's awareness was fighting to survive. And Administrator? We leave in 6 hours. If we're going to save this world, we need to get started before the system failures spread any further. The entrance to Gaia's core consciousness access tunnels looked like a natural cave mouth, but Victor could feel the subtle wrongness that suggested biological systems under extreme stress. Plants around the cave entrance were wilting, despite abundant water and sunlight. Rock formations showed stress fractures that hadn't been there hours earlier, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the irregular rhythms of a failing planetary heartbeat. Captain, Dr. Morgan said as they checked their underground exploration equipment, I need you to understand that the cave systems may change as we descend. Gaia's defensive systems include the ability to alter tunnel configurations, create new obstacles, or seal passages to prevent access to critical areas. Victor looked at the portable navigation sensors he'd adapted from his ship's systems. Dr. Morgan, that just means the navigation problem is dynamic instead of static. I've flown through plenty of hazards that change while I was flying through them. But Captain, underground you won't have the option to retreat if conditions become impossible. These tunnels only go one direction, and the surface access points seal once you've passed certain depth thresholds. Victor had been expecting something like this. So we're committed once we start the descent. Yes, and Captain, with Gaia's consciousness failing, there's no guarantee that the access tunnels will remain stable enough for return journey even if we successfully reach the core centers. Administrator Earthsong approached with final mission. Updates. Captain, our monitoring stations are showing accelerated neural web failures throughout the northern continent. We're estimating less than 50 hours before total biosphere collapse. Victor shouldered his pack, which contained navigation equipment, emergency supplies, and repair tools adapted from ship maintenance kits. Administrator, that gives us about 40 hours to reach the core centers, figure out what's wrong, fix it, and confirm that Gaia's consciousness is restored. Captain, are you certain you want to proceed? The risks, Administrator. 43 billion beings are going to die if we don't try. The risks of attempting this mission are acceptable compared to the certainty of planetary death if we do nothing. Dr. Morgan activated her portable research equipment, which would allow her to monitor neural web activity and consciousness patterns during their descent. Captain, I have to ask, what makes you think we can repair something that Gaia's own consciousness couldn't fix? Victor looked at the cave entrance, thinking about decades of solving problems that automated systems couldn't handle. Dr. Morgan, sometimes complex systems fail because they're trying to solve the wrong problem, or because they're stuck in a loop that prevents them from seeing alternative solutions. An outside perspective can sometimes identify approaches that the system itself wouldn't consider. And if you're wrong, then we die trying to save the world instead of watching it die from a safe distance. The first kilometer of descent was manageable natural cave passages that required careful navigation, but didn't present unusual hazards. Victor used his adapted ship sensors to map the route ahead, while Dr. Morgan monitored the increasing neural web activity as they approached deeper consciousness layers. Captain, Dr. Morgan reported, the neural web density is increasing exponentially as we descend. We're beginning to encounter active consciousness nodes that are still connected to Gaia's central awareness. Victor could feel the difference. The cave walls around them seemed to pulse with living energy, and the air carried subtle vibrations that suggested they were moving through the neural tissue of a vast, dying mind. Dr. Morgan, are the active consciousness nodes responding to our presence? Yes, but the responses are erratic. Some nodes seem to recognize us as authorized personnel, while others are treating us as potential threats. Captain, I think Gaia's consciousness is too damaged to maintain consistent recognition protocols. The second kilometer brought their first encounter with active defensive systems. Victor's navigation sensors detected movement in the cave walls. Ahead passages that were shifting configuration, obstacles that were growing to block their route, and what appeared to be biological defensive mechanisms activating in response to their approach. Dr. Morgan, I'm reading environmental changes ahead that suggest the tunnel system is trying to prevent our further descent. Captain, that would be consistent with defensive systems that have lost communication with central consciousness. They're following basic protection protocols without understanding that we're here to help. Victor studied his sensor readings, noting patterns in the defensive activations that suggested automated responses rather than intelligent opposition. Dr. Morgan, the defensive systems are following predictable patterns. If I can time our movement, to avoid the active defense phases, we should be able to continue descending. How can you predict automated biological defensive systems? Same way I predict automated defense grids, asteroid collision patterns, or any other hazardous environment with regular cycles. You observe the patterns, identify the safe intervals, and move during the windows when the hazards are minimized. Victor spent 20 minutes mapping the defensive system activation cycles, then led Dr. Morgan through passages that were shifting and changing around them, timing their movement to avoid biological obstacles that could have trapped or injured them. By the third kilometer, they were encountering consciousness nodes that were directly connected to Gaia's failing central awareness. Dr. Morgan's equipment detected communication attempts complex, biological signals that seemed to be requests for information or assistance. Captain, Gaia's consciousness is trying to communicate with us directly. The signals are fragmented and inconsistent, but I think the planetary awareness recognizes that we're attempting to reach the core centers. Victor paused to examine his navigation. Readings noting that the tunnel configuration ahead had stabilized rather than continuing to shift defensively. Dr. Morgan, I think Gaia's consciousness is helping us now. The tunnel system has stopped trying to block our descent, and I'm seeing navigation markers that weren't there before. Navigation markers? Victor pointed to subtle changes in the cave wall formations that seemed to indicate optimal route choices. Biological formations that show us the safest path forward. Dr. Morgan, I think Gaia is using what's left of its consciousness to guide us to the core centers. The 4th kilometer brought them into contact with neural web density that was almost overwhelming. Dr. Morgan's equipment detected consciousness activity that exceeded anything she had measured on the surface, but the signals were chaotic and contradictory. Captain, we're approaching the outer layers of the core consciousness region. The neural web activity is intense, but it's clearly malfunctioning. I'm detecting signal patterns that suggest massive data processing errors and system conflicts. Victor was beginning to understand what they were dealing with. Dr. Morgan, this looks like what happens when a complex system gets caught in recursive problem-solving loops. A consciousness is trying to solve a problem, but its attempts to solve the problem are making the problem worse, which triggers more attempts to solve the problem. That would explain why our surface interventions haven't been effective. If Gaia's consciousness is stuck in recursive failure loops, external assistance won't help until the loops are broken. The 5th kilometer brought them to the threshold of the core consciousness region, where Victor's sensors detected neural web activity so intense that it was affecting their equipment and even their own neural systems. Dr. Morgan, I'm getting interference on all navigation sensors. The consciousness activity down here is affecting our electronic equipment. Captain, I'm experiencing direct neural interface with Gaia's consciousness. It's overwhelming, like trying to think 43 billion thoughts simultaneously while processing sensory data from an entire planet. Victor felt it too, a pressure in his mind that suggested contact with an intelligence so vast and complex that human consciousness couldn't fully comprehend it. But underneath the overwhelming scale, he could sense something familiar. Dr. Morgan, underneath all the complexity, this feels like a mind that's in pain. Gaia's consciousness isn't just malfunctioning, it's suffering. They reached the entrance to the core consciousness centers after 8 hours of descent through increasingly complex biological systems. The chamber ahead pulsed with light and energy that suggested they had reached the heart of a dying planetary mind. Captain, Dr. Morgan said quietly, we're about to enter the consciousness center of an entire world. Are you ready for this? Victor looked at the entrance to chambers, where the awareness of 43 billion beings was fighting to survive, using navigation skills and repair experience that had never been tested on problems of this magnitude. Dr. Morgan, I'm ready to find out what's actually broken and try to fix it. The core consciousness center was unlike anything Victor had imagined. Instead of technological equipment or biological structures, the chamber was filled with what could only be described as living light energy patterns that moved through three-dimensional space with intelligence and purpose, forming connections and relationships that suggested the physical manifestation of thought itself. Captain, Dr. Morgan whispered, we're inside Gaia's mind. Those light patterns are neural activity made visible, the actual thoughts and consciousness processes of the entire planet. Victor watched the light patterns, noting rhythms and cycles that reminded him of data flows in complex computer networks. But there was something wrong with the patterns areas where the light was dim or flickering. connections that sparked and failed, an overall activity that suggested a system in distress. Dr. Morgan, look at the pattern distribution. The consciousness activity isn't coordinated. It's fragmenting into separate, processing clusters that aren't communicating effectively with each other. As they move deeper into the consciousness center, Victor could feel Gaia's awareness, focusing on them with desperate intensity. The light patterns around them became brighter and more complex, and he began to sense something that felt like communication attempts. Dr. Morgan, I think Gaia is trying to tell us something. The light patterns are changing in response to our presence. Dr. Morgan was working frantically with her equipment, trying to translate the consciousness patterns into information they could understand. Captain, I'm detecting communication attempts, but they're too complex for my translation systems. Gia is trying to convey information at processing speeds and complexity levels that human minds can't directly interface with. Victor studied the light patterns more carefully, looking for the kind of diagnostic information he would need to troubleshoot any complex failing system. Dr. Morgan, forget about translating the communication. Focus on identifying the malfunction. Patterns. What parts of the consciousness system are working normally, and what parts are showing stress or failure indicators? Dr. Morgan shifted her approach, using her equipment to map the consciousness activity patterns rather than trying to decode their meaning. Captain, I'm seeing massive processing conflicts in the central coordination nodes. It looks like Gaia's consciousness is trying to solve multiple incompatible problems simultaneously, and the attempts to resolve these conflicts are causing cascading failures throughout the neural web. Victor was beginning to see a familiar pattern. Dr. Morgan, this looks like what happens when a navigation computer gets conflicting input from multiple sensor systems. The system tries to reconcile contradictory information, gets caught in processing loops, and eventually crashes from computational overload. But Captain, what could cause conflicting input problems for a planetary consciousness? Victor studied the light patterns again, this time focusing on the areas where processing conflicts seemed most intense. Dr. Morgan, what if the problem isn't with Gaia's consciousness itself, but with the information the consciousness is receiving? As if responding to his question, the light patterns around them shifted to show Victor something that made him understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. The patterns revealed Gaia's perspective on the planet's biological system's 43 billion individual lives, each with needs, desires, fears, and dreams that the planetary consciousness was trying to coordinate and support. But mixed in with the normal biological signals were patterns that looked wrong, signals that suggested beings in distress, species under threat, ecological systems that were being damaged faster than they could be repaired. Dr. Morgan, I think I see the problem. Gaia's consciousness is receiving distress signals from throughout the biosphere, species extinctions, ecological damage, environmental degradation, and the consciousness is trying to solve all of these problems simultaneously. But Captain, that's what Gaia has always done. Planetary consciousness exists to coordinate and maintain ecological balance. Victor watched the light patterns more carefully, noting the difference between normal coordination activities and the processing conflicts that were causing the consciousness failures. Dr. Morgan, look at the scale of the distress signals. This isn't normal ecological management. Something has been sending Gaia distress information that exceeds the consciousness system's ability to process and respond. The light patterns shifted again, showing Victor information flows that came from outside Gaia's normal biosphere, signals that originated in space, carried by ships and communication systems that brought news of ecological disasters, species extinctions, and environmental collapses happening throughout the galaxy. My God, Dr. Morgan said as she began to understand what Victor was seeing. Captain, Gaia's consciousness has been receiving information about ecological disasters throughout the galaxy. The planetary mind is trying to solve not just local environmental problems, but galactic-scale ecological crises that are impossible for any single planet to address. Victor felt the pieces clicking into place. Dr. Morgan, Gaia's consciousness is too empathic, too connected. It's not just managing this planet's ecology, it's trying to heal ecological damage throughout the entire galaxy. And the processing load is causing system-wide failure. The light patterns around them pulsed with what Victor interpreted as confirmation and desperate hope. Gaia's consciousness had been slowly destroying itself, trying to solve problems that were too vast for any planetary intelligence to address alone. Captain, if you're right, how do we fix this? How do we stop a planetary consciousness from trying to heal the galaxy? Victor thought about 20 years of dealing with systems that had been programmed with impossible objectives, computers that crashed because they were given tasks that exceeded their capabilities. Dr. Morgan, we don't stop Gaia from caring about galactic ecology. We help the consciousness understand the difference between problems it can solve and problems that require different approaches. How? Victor looked at the light patterns that represented the dying thoughts of an entire world, and made a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned. Dr. Morgan, I'm going to establish direct neural interface with Gaia's consciousness. If I can communicate directly with the planetary mind, I might be able to help it understand how to manage the information overload that's causing the processing failures. Captain, that's insanely dangerous. Human minds aren't designed to interface with planetary-scale consciousness. The neural feedback could kill you or drive you insane. Victor began activating the emergency interface protocols he'd found in his ship's first aid systems procedures designed for establishing communication with alien intelligences during medical emergencies. Dr. Morgan, 43 billion beings are going to die if we don't try something. And I think I understand what Gaia needs to hear. Victor initiated the neural interface, feeling his consciousness expand beyond human limitations to touch the vast, suffering mind of a dying world. The connection was overwhelming. Suddenly Victor could perceive the thoughts and needs of every living being on the planet, feel the pain of ecological systems under stress, and understand the impossible complexity of coordinating life on a galactic scale. But he could also feel Gaia's confusion, the recursive processing loops that were destroying the planetary consciousness, and the desperate need for someone to help the world understand how to focus its caring on problems it could actually solve. Gaia, Victor projected through the neural interface. You're trying to heal wounds that are too big for any single world to address. You have to focus on what you can fix this planet, these people, this biosphere. The planetary consciousness responded with a mixture of understanding and resistant compassion. Gaia wanted to help heal ecological damage throughout the galaxy, wanted to prevent the extinctions and environmental collapses that were causing such distress signals. I understand, Victor projected. But you can help the galaxy more by being a healthy example than by destroying yourself trying to solve everyone's problems. Focus on healing what you can heal. Let others work on the problems they can solve. Victor felt Gaia's consciousness beginning to understand, beginning to separate local ecological management from impossible galactic healing objectives. That's it, Victor encouraged as he felt the processing loops beginning to break. Focus on this world, these lives, this biosphere. Be the healthy planet that shows others what's possible. The light patterns in the consciousness center began to stabilize as Gaia's awareness shifted from impossible galactic objectives to manageable planetary coordination. The recursive processing loops dissolved, and Victor felt the vast intelligence settling into sustainable thought patterns. Thank you. Gaia's consciousness communicated directly to Victor's mind. I understand now. I will heal what I can heal, and trust others to heal what they can heal. Victor carefully disconnected the neural interface, feeling his consciousness return to human limitations, while retaining the memory of touching a mind vast enough to coordinate an entire world. "Dr. Morgan," he said weakly, "I think it worked." Gaia understands now that it needs to focus on local healing rather than trying to solve galactic problems. The light patterns in the consciousness center had stabilized into healthy, coordinated activity. Throughout the chamber, Victor could see the neural connections re-establishing themselves, the processing conflicts resolving, and the consciousness activity returning to sustainable levels. "Captain, the neural web activity readings are normalizing. Whatever you did, it's working." Victor felt Gaia's consciousness gently guiding them toward the surface, providing navigation assistance and healing the damage their descent had caused to the access tunnels. "Dr. Morgan, I think our work here is done. Gaia is healing itself now, and it's going to be able to maintain planetary ecological balance without destroying itself, trying to heal the entire galaxy." As they began their return journey to the surface, Victor realized that the most important repair he'd ever made wasn't to a machine, but to a mind helping a world understand the difference between problems it could solve and problems that required collaboration with others. The return journey to the surface took half as long as the descent, with Gaia's restored consciousness actively assisting their navigation and healing the tunnel systems around them. By the time Victor and Dr. Morgan emerged from the caves, the changes in the planet's condition were already visible. Plants around the cave entrance were recovering their vitality, rock formations were stabilizing, and the air itself felt more alive, charged with the healthy energy of a world whose consciousness was functioning properly again. "Captain Petrov," Administrator Earthsong called as she ran toward them from the research station. "Our monitoring systems are showing restored neural web activity throughout the planet. Whatever you did in the core consciousness centers, it's working." Victor looked up at the sky, where cloud formations were already shifting into the perfectly coordinated patterns that indicated active planetary weather management. "Administrator, Gaia's consciousness is functioning normally now. The planet will be able to maintain ecological balance and coordinate life support systems." "But Captain, what was wrong? What caused the consciousness failure?" Dr. Morgan was reviewing the data she'd collected during their mission. "Administrator, Gaia's consciousness was receiving distress signals about ecological problems throughout the galaxy and trying to solve crises that were too vast for any single planetary intelligence to address. The processing overload caused recursive system failures that were destroying the consciousness." "And how did you fix it?" Victor thought about his brief contact with Gaia's vast consciousness, the communication that had helped the planetary mind understand how to focus its caring on problems it could actually solve. "Administrator, we helped Gaia understand the difference between local problems it could solve and galactic problems that require different approaches. The consciousness is still empathic and caring, but now it's focused on healing what it can heal rather than trying to heal everything at once." As they spoke, Victor felt a subtle shift in his awareness, not the overwhelming connection he'd experienced in the consciousness center, but a gentle sense of being watched over by a benevolent planetary intelligence. Administrator Earthsong noticed Victor's expression. "Captain, are you all right?" "Administrator, I think Gaia has established a permanent communication link with me. Nothing overwhelming, just awareness that the planet is grateful and wants to stay in touch." Dr. Morgan was studying readings from her equipment. "Captain, the neural web is showing unusual activity patterns around your location. I think you're right, Gaia has formed a permanent connection with you. What does that mean?" "It means you're the first human to be directly connected to a planetary consciousness. Captain, you're going to be able to sense Gaia's health and well-being for the rest of your life." Victor realized that his relationship with this world had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a human pilot who had helped with an emergency. He was now permanently connected to the consciousness of an entire planet. "Administrator, what happens now?" I was supposed to be making a cargo delivery to the Centauri colonies. Administrator Ursong smiled the first genuine smile Victor had seen from her since his arrival. Captain, Gaia's consciousness has made a request through the communication channels we use for planetary coordination. What kind of request? The planet wants to offer you permanent residency here, with a position as our liaison to human space. Gaia wants to establish formal diplomatic relations with human worlds, sharing knowledge about ecological management and planetary consciousness development. Victor looked around at the world that was already showing signs of recovery and renewed vitality. Administrator, you're offering me a job as a planetary diplomat? More than that, Captain. Gaia wants you to serve as the primary interface between planetary consciousness and human space. You would help other worlds understand how to develop sustainable relationships with their biospheres, and help human colonies avoid the ecological mistakes that have caused so much galactic environmental damage. Victor felt the gentle presence of Gaia's consciousness in his mind, communicating gratitude, affection, and a desire for continued partnership that transcended normal diplomatic relationships. Administrator, I need to ask, what about my cargo? Deliveries? My ship? I have contracts and responsibilities. Administrator Earthsong consulted her datapad. Captain, Gia's consciousness has already contacted the shipping companies you work for. The planet has offered to compensate them for contract cancellations and to purchase the wandering star at a price that exceeds its market value. The planet is buying my ship? Captain, Gaia wants to ensure you have no financial concerns that might interfere with your decision. The consciousness understands that humans have economic needs that must be addressed for sustainable life planning. Victor realized that a planetary intelligence had just solved all his practical concerns about accepting a position he'd never imagined could exist. And what would my actual responsibilities be? Dr. Morgan, who had been listening to the conversation, while analyzing her research data, looked up with excitement. Captain, you would be working with me and other xenobiologists to develop protocols for establishing healthy relationships between human colonies and planetary biospheres. Your experience with Gaia's consciousness makes you uniquely qualified to help other worlds avoid the kind of ecological crisis that almost destroyed this planet. You're talking about preventing planetary-scale environmental collapse throughout human space. Captain, we're talking about teaching human colonies how to work with planetary ecosystems instead of trying to dominate them. Your neural connection with Gaia gives you insights into planetary consciousness that could revolutionize how humans approach colonization and environmental management. Victor felt Gaia's gentle communication again, sharing concepts and ideas that were too complex for human language, but conveyed the planet's vision of ecological cooperation between species and worlds. Administrator, Dr. Morgan, I think I understand what Gaia is offering. Not just a job, but a chance to help prevent the kind of ecological disasters that were causing the galactic distress signals that nearly destroyed this world's consciousness. Exactly. Captain, and you would be doing this work from a world that has achieved perfect ecological balance, with direct access to planetary consciousness guidance and the most advanced ecological management systems in known space. Victor looked up at the sky again, feeling Gaia's awareness surrounding him with warmth and welcome. After 22 years of flying through space, carrying cargo from one world to another, he was being offered the chance to help worlds learn to truly live. Administrator, I accept the position, but I have some conditions. Of course, Captain. What do you need? First, I want Dr. Morgan as my primary research partner. If we're going to teach humans how to work with planetary consciousness, I'll need someone who understands the science behind what we're doing. Dr. Morgan smiled. Captain, I would be honored to work with you on this project. Second, I want to maintain my pilot's license and keep emergency flight capabilities available. If there are other worlds facing ecological crises, I want to be able to provide direct assistance. Captain, Administrator Earthsong said, Gaia's consciousness has already considered that possibility. The planet is prepared to provide you with the most advanced spacecraft available, designed specifically for ecological emergency response missions. And third, I want regular communication with human space. If I'm going to serve as a liaison between Gaia and human worlds, I need to stay informed about colonial development and environmental challenges throughout human-controlled space. All acceptable conditions, Captain. When would you like to begin your new responsibilities? Victor felt Gaia's consciousness gently encouraging him, sharing anticipation and excitement about the collaborative work they would do together. Administrator, I think I already have begun. Gaia is sharing ideas with me about ecological management, techniques that could help prevent the environmental problems that caused this crisis in the first place. 2 years later, Captain Victor Petrov now, Ambassador Victor Petrov stood in the command center of the ecological research vessel Gia's Dream, monitoring environmental conditions on 12 human colony worlds that were implementing the planetary consciousness cooperation protocols he and Dr. Morgan had developed. The results exceeded anyone's expectations. Colonies that had been struggling with environmental degradation, resource depletion, and ecological instability were now thriving in partnership with their planetary biospheres. More importantly, 3 worlds had begun developing their own forms of planetary consciousness nascent, global awareness that could coordinate ecological systems and support sustainable development. Ambassador, Dr. Morgan reported from her research station, we're receiving a priority distress signal from the Kepler 442b colony. They're reporting cascading ecosystem failures that their local environmental management can't address. Victor felt Gaia's consciousness responding to the distress signal with the same empathic concern that had nearly destroyed the planet 2 years earlier. But now the planetary intelligence understood how to channel that concern into effective assistance rather than self-destructive processing loops. Dr. Morgan, prepare the emergency ecological response team. Gaia is providing analysis suggesting that Kepler 442b is experiencing the same kind of information overload crisis that we solved here. A planetary consciousness that's trying to solve problems beyond its processing capabilities. Exactly. And we now know how to help a world understand the difference between local problems it can solve and galactic problems that require cooperative approaches. As the Gaia's Dream prepared for departure, Victor felt the familiar sensation of Gaia's consciousness maintaining connection across interstellar distances. The planetary intelligence had learned to extend its awareness through specially designed communication and ETWORKs that allowed ongoing collaboration with other worlds without risking processing overload. Ambassador, Dr. Morgan said as they entered. Hyperspace, what do you think we'll find at Kepler 442b? Victor smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought him from cargo pilot to planetary ambassador, and the impossible repairs that had taught him how to heal minds as well as machines. Dr. Morgan, I think we'll find a world that needs to learn the same lesson Gaia learned, that caring about everything is less effective than focusing your care on what you can actually heal. The Gaia's Dream carried Victor toward another impossible problem, another world in crisis, another opportunity to prove that understanding and compassion could overcome any challenge when applied with wisdom rather than overwhelming ambition. Victor Petrov, Ambassador of Planetary Consciousness, and the first human to be permanently connected to a world's living intelligence, continued his work healing the relationships between civilizations and the SIL, worlds that supported them. It was exactly the kind of impossible job that reminded him why he'd never wanted to do anything except help things work the way they were supposed to work.